The howling wind carried ice that cut like glass as James Miller trudged through knee-deep snow, his rifle slung across his back. He never expected to find anyone alive this far up Widow's Peak, especially not as December's grip tightened on the Rockies. But there she was, half-frozen, skeletal thin, huddled in the remains of what was once a prospector's cabin. Their eyes met through the collapsed doorway, hers wild with fear and desperation. Neither could have imagined that before spring, thawed the mountain passes. They would be bound together in a marriage neither wanted, a desperate arrangement that would either save them both or destroy them. This is the true story of Emma Thompson and James Miller, two souls thrown together by the merciless winter of 1878, and how survival sometimes demands the ultimate sacrifice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pine Ridge, Colorado wasn't a town so much as a stubborn collection of cabins and claims clinging to the mountainside where silver had been discovered 5 years earlier. By 1878, most of the easy riches had been stripped away, leaving only the hardiest souls to battle the elements in hopes of striking what remained. The Miller family homestead sat in a sheltered valley, a mile from the main settlement, protected from the worst mountain winds by a stand of ancient pines that gave the settlement its name. The cabin that Robert Miller had built with his own, hence stood as a testament to his determination. Thick logs, chinked with mud and moss, kept the bitter cold at bay, while a stone chimney drew smoke from the perpetual fire that was the heart of their home during the long mountain winters. It wasn't grand by any measure, but it was sturdy and warm, two qualities that meant the difference between life and death when snow buried the world from November through April. Inside these walls, Robert and Margaret had raised 3 children, who knew the mountain's moods as intimately as they knew each other. Daniel, the eldest at 24, had his father's broad shoulders and calm demeanor. Rebecca, 20 and quick-witted, managed the household alongside her mother with practical efficiency. And then there was James, 22, whose restless spirit seemed most alive when he roamed the ridges and valleys that others avoided. That November morning had dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline beauty that James had always found irresistible. "Going to check the western traps," he announced over breakfast, already reaching for his heavy coat. His mother looked up from the hearth where cornmeal mush bubbled in a cast-iron pot. "The sky's too clear," Margaret cautioned, her experienced eyes glancing toward the small window. "Weather's fixing to turn. I can feel it in my joints." Robert nodded in agreement, his weathered face solemn. "Your mother's never wrong about a storm brewing. Best stay close today." But James had already shouldered his pack, his mind set on the quiet solitude of the high country. "I'll be back before dark," he promised, the door closing behind him before anyone could argue further. The crisp mountain air filled his lungs as he struck out along the familiar trail, frost crunching beneath his boots. Above him, the sky stretched, endlessly blue, betraying nothing of the change his parents had predicted. By midday, James had cleared 6 traps, securing 2 rabbits and a fox to his belt. Good hunting, considering how the game had grown scarce as winter approached. He paused atop a ridge, chewing on jerky as he surveyed the vastness before him. From this height, he could see clear to the abandoned Blackwater mine, its weathered structures barely visible in the distance. Something tugged at his attention, a wisp of smoke, so faint he nearly missed it, curling from what should have been an empty claim shack near the mine entrance. Curiosity piqued, James adjusted his course. Nobody had worked that claim since. Old Man Patterson had died in a cave-in last spring. Perhaps passing trappers had taken shelter, or worse, claimed jumpers thinking to work the mine during the quiet winter months. Either way, it warranted investigation. The first snowflakes began to fall as James crossed Whispering Creek, freezing almost instantly on his coat. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals against his face with increasing fury. His mother's warning echoed in his mind as the blue sky vanished behind a wall of grey. Within an hour, visibility had shrunk to mere yards ahead, and the temperature plummeted. James knew these mountains well enough to respect their dangers. Turning back now meant risking disorientation in the whiteout. The abandoned claim shack, however distant, offered his best hope for shelter until the storm passed. Each step became a battle as the snow deepened and the wind howled down from the peaks. James pulled his scarf tight across his mouth, his breath freezing in his beard as he forced himself forward. The fox and rabbit swung heavy at his side, their bodies already stiffening in the intense cold. As darkness began to claim the mountain, panic flickered at the edges of his mind. Lost in a blizzard, even an experienced mountaineer could quickly succumb to the killing cold. Then, through a momentary break in the swirling snow, he spotted it. The sagging roof of the Patterson claim shack, partially collapsed but still standing. Relief surged through him as he pushed toward the structure, now only 100 yards away. The smoke he'd spotted earlier had vanished, blown away by the strengthening gale. The door hung crookedly on one leather hinge, half blocked by a drift of snow. James shouldered it open, grateful for any shelter, however meager. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow of dying embers in a crude stone fireplace. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, a sharp intake of breath from the corner froze him in place. He wasn't alone. Huddled in a nest of ragged blankets, pressed against the far wall, was a woman. Even in the poor light, James could see her face was gaunt, her eyes enormous with fear in her hollow face. A tangle of dark hair fell across shoulders so thin they seemed incapable of supporting even the threadbare coat she clutched around herself. "I'm not here to harm you," James said quickly, keeping his voice low, and even as he would when approaching. "A frightened animal. I was caught in the storm, just need shelter until it passes." The woman didn't respond, but her eyes darted to the rifle on his back, then to the game hanging from his belt. James noticed and slowly removed his pack, setting it and his rifle carefully on the floor away from him. He untied the rabbits and fox, placing them near the dying fire. "I have food," he said, reaching into his pack for jerky and a small pouch of parched corn. "You're welcome to share." At the mention of food, something changed in the woman's posture. Hunger overcame fear as she uncurled slightly from her defensive position. In the strengthening firelight, as James added wood from a small pile near the hearth, he could see just how desperate her condition truly was. Her cheekbones jutted sharply beneath papery skin, and her wrists extending from the coat sleeves were no thicker than kindling. "How long have you been here?" James asked, working to keep the shock from his voice as he handed her a strip of jerky. She snatched it with surprising speed, tearing at it with teeth that seemed too large for her wasted face. "Don't know," she finally whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "The snows came early." "I'm James Miller," he offered, feeding the fire carefully to build its warmth without consuming the precious wood too quickly. She swallowed the last of the jerky before answering. Emma Thompson. You're a long way from anywhere, Miss Thompson." She didn't reply, her attention fixed on the small portion of parched corn he'd placed before her. James busied himself, skinning the first rabbit, giving her privacy to eat. The storm outside intensified, wind shrieking through the gaps in the walls and roof. Snow dusted through in fine powder, accumulating in small drifts along the edges of the room. "We'll need to block those gaps," James said practically, eyeing the deteriorating shelter, "and conserve the wood. This storm has settled in for the night, maybe longer." Emma watched him warily as he moved around the small space, stuffing his spare clothing into the largest holes, packing snow against the outside of the door for insulation. She flinched when he came too close, but didn't retreat further into her corner. Progress, however small. As James spitted the rabbit over the flames, the rich aroma of cooking meat filled the shack. He noticed Emma watching with an intensity that spoke volumes about her hunger. "There's plenty," he assured her. "When did you last eat properly?" Emma's hollow eyes reflected the firelight. "I've been making a little cornmeal last. Found some old supplies, but it ran out 3 days. Argo. And before that, where did you come from?" The question seemed to build a wall between them. Emma's face closed, her gaze dropping to the dirt floor. "East," was all she said, and James knew better than to press. The mountains attracted all kinds, fortune seekers, fugitives, those running from troubles or painful memories. Everyone in Pine Ridge respected the unwritten code. A person's past was their own business. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, an uneasy truce formed in the flickering firelight. James kept to his side of the small space, offering food but not questions. Emma gradually relaxed enough to sleep, though she positioned herself where she could see both James and the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James took first watch, knowing that in such bitter cold, letting the fire die could mean death for them both. He studied her as she slept, wondering at the circumstances that had brought such a young woman. She couldn't be more than 20, to this remote place alone. Her clothes, though filthy and torn, had once been of good quality. Her speech, the little he'd heard, carried the refinement of education. Not a typical prospector or mountain dweller. The wind moaned through the trees outside, driving snow into drifts that would soon make travel impossible. James fed another precious log to the fire and calculated their chances. His family would be worried sick, but they wouldn't expect him to attempt the journey home in such conditions. They would assume he'd found shelter, which he had, if barely. The question now was how long the storm would last and whether their meager supplies would sustain 2 people until it broke. As if sensing his thoughts, Emma stirred, her eyes opening with immediate alertness. "How bad is it?" she asked, nodding toward the door where snow had piled halfway up the frame. "Bad enough," James admitted. "We're here for at least a day, maybe more." He didn't add what they both knew, that in the high country, winter storms could last for days, even weeks, or that in these temperatures, without adequate food and shelter, survival became a matter of hours, not days. Emma pulled herself up to sitting, wincing slightly. For the first time, James noticed how she favored her right leg. "Are you injured?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Fell about a week ago, coming back from the creek. It's better now, but I can't move." Quickly. The implication hung in the air between them. Even if the storm cleared, she couldn't make the journey down the mountain. Not alone, and certainly not through deep snow with an injured leg. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, the storm had intensified, rattling the shack's remaining walls with frightening force. James carefully opened the door just enough to gauge conditions, receiving a faceful of snow and wind for his efforts. Visibility was near zero, the temperature well below freezing. "We need to consolidate our supplies," he said, pushing the door closed and securing it with a length of rope from his pack. "What do you have left?" Emma reluctantly revealed her meager stockpile: a few matches, a dented tin cup, half a candle, and a small knife with a broken tip. "I was going to try reaching town when my food ran out," she admitted, "but then the snow started." James didn't state the obvious, that she would have died attempting such a journey in her weakened condition. Instead, he inventoried his own supplies: jerky, parched corn, a small flask of whiskey for medicinal purposes, fish hooks and line, his hunting knife, a tinderbox, and a small kettle. 2 days' worth of food if stretched carefully, but nothing that would sustain them if the storm lasted much longer. "We need to think beyond the storm," James said finally, watching more snow filter through the damaged roof. Winter's just beginning. Even if this breaks, the passes will be closed until spring. Emma's face remained impassive, but her hands tightened on the threadbare blanket. I know. My family's cabin is a day's journey in good conditions, James continued, but with your leg and in deep snow. I'd slow you down, she finished flatly. You should go when you can. I'll manage. James shook his head, watching. The fire burned dangerously low. That's not what I meant. You won't survive here alone, and I won't leave you to die. He paused, considering their limited options. When the storm breaks, I'll need to get word to my family, bring back supplies. But I'll return for you. Something like hope flickered briefly in Emma's eyes before caution reasserted itself. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Out here, we help each other. It's how we survive. James meant it simply as truth, not kindness. In the mountains, refusing aid to someone in need wasn't just callous. It was a death sentence, one that few could bear on their conscience. As the day progressed, they fell into an uneasy rhythm, taking turns tending the fire, sharing small portions of food, and speaking little. Outside, the world had disappeared beneath a blanket of white, the howling wind, their only connection to the world beyond their fragile shelter. By evening, the temperature had dropped further, and both could see their breath even beside the fire. James noticed Emma shivering, despite huddling close to the flames. Her threadbare coat and blanket provided little protection against the penetrating cold. Without speaking, he removed his heavy outer coat and held it out to her. She stared at it without moving. You'll freeze. I have layers, he said simply, and we'll share the blankets tonight. Body heat is the most efficient way to survive temperatures like this. Emma's posture stiffened, alarm replacing the gratitude that had briefly crossed her face. I can't. It's not a request, James interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than harsh. This isn't about propriety. It's about survival. The fire won't last the night, and temperatures will drop further. Either we conserve heat together, or we risk freezing separately. The practicality of his argument must have reached her, because Emma reluctantly nodded. James arranged their sleeping space near the dying embers, layering what blankets they had with his coat as a top covering. Still, Emma hesitated, her expression caught between fear and necessity. I won't touch you beyond what's needed for warmth, James promised, understanding her reservation. A woman alone had every reason to be wary, especially of a strange man, in an isolated place. You have my word. And what is the word of a stranger worth? Emma asked, though she moved tentatively toward the makeshift bed. Out here, everything. James lay down on the outer edge, leaving space for Emma between himself and the warmth of the fire's remnants. It's the only currency that matters in the mountains. Eventually, necessity overcame caution, and Emma settled herself as far from him as the small space allowed. Even so, James could feel her trembling, whether from cold or fear. He couldn't tell. Both lay rigid, backs to each other, as the fire died to glowing coals and darkness claimed the shack. Outside, the relentless storm continued its assault, burying them deeper beneath the snow with each passing hour. Inside, two strangers confronted the uncomfortable intimacy forced upon them by circumstance, acutely aware that the most dangerous season of their lives had only just begun. The night passed in fitful snatches of sleep, interrupted by the need to feed the fire and the constant battle against encroaching cold. By morning, a tenuous trust had formed, the kind born not of choice but necessity. When James rose to check the conditions outside, Emma didn't flinch away as he passed her. Small progress, but significant. The news outside was grim. Snow had nearly buried the small shack, with only a portion of the door and damaged roof visible. The storm showed no signs of abating, white oblivion extending in all directions. James managed to clear a small area around the entrance, but beyond that was impossible. "We need to think about rationing more strictly," he said upon returning, shaking snow from his clothes. "This could last days yet." Emma nodded, her face resigned. She had already divided their remaining food into tiny portions, laid out on a clean section of bark. James noted that her share was smaller than his and started to object, but something in her expression stopped him. Pride was sometimes the only possession left when everything else was stripped away. He wouldn't take that from her. As the second day in the shack progressed, they began to talk more, necessity eroding the barriers between them. Emma revealed she had come west with a mining company from Boston, working as a teacher for the children of investors and workers. "When the main vein played out and they abandoned the camp, I stayed behind," she explained, carefully feeding twigs to the dwindling fire. "I had arrangements to join my cousin in Denver, but circumstances changed." James didn't press for details about those circumstances, offering instead stories of his own family's journey to Pine Ridge when he was just 10 years old. "My father heard silver whispers in his dreams," he said with a small smile. "Mother said he had mountain fever in his blood and there was no curing it. And you?" Emma asked, the first personal question she'd ventured. "Do you have the same fever?" James considered this as he melted snow in his small kettle for drinking water. Not for silver, but for the mountains themselves. "Yes, they speak a language I understand." Something shifted in Emma's gaze then. A recognition, perhaps, that beyond their current desperate situation existed a person with dreams and values of his own. The realization humanized him in a way that mere survival cooperation hadn't. By the third day, their food supplies had dwindled alarmingly, and the woodpile had shrunk to a handful of sticks. The storm continued unabated, trapping them in a world that grew colder and more desperate by the hour. James began breaking up the single chair in the shack for fuel, knowing even this wouldn't last another full day. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said finally, the words hanging heavy in the frigid air between them. "If this doesn't break soon." Emma met his gaze steadily, surprising him with her calmness. "We die. I've been facing that possibility for weeks now." Her matter-of-factness struck James with unexpected force. This woman had been slowly starving alone on a mountainside, watching her supplies dwindle day by day, yet had fought to survive. There was a strength in her he hadn't fully appreciated until now. "My family will come searching once the storm clears," James said, trying to inject certainty into his voice. "Father knows these mountains as well as anyone, and Daniel's the best tracker in the territory. But they won't know to look here," Emma countered gently, "and by the time they find us—" She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. The cold was becoming their most immediate enemy, seeping into their bones despite their best efforts. Without adequate heat, their bodies would shut down long before starvation claimed them. As darkness fell again, they huddled closer than before, no longer separated by propriety or caution. Survival had stripped away such luxuries. Under the shared blankets and James's coat, they pressed together, preserving what little body heat remained between them. "Tell me about your family," Emma whispered, her breath warm against his shoulder, creating a small fog in the freezing air. "The people who will miss you." James understood what she was really asking. "Tell me you're not alone, that someone cares enough to search until they find you, dead or alive, that someone will remember you existed." So he told her about Robert's booming laugh and infinite patience, about Margaret's healing hands and quiet wisdom, about Daniel's steady dependability, and Rebecca's fierce intelligence. He described Christmas mornings around the stone fireplace, hunting expeditions with his father and brother, and summer evenings when Rebecca would read aloud from precious books while their mother mended clothes. "They sound wonderful," Emma murmured, her voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. "They are," James affirmed, "and they'll welcome you too when we reach them." "If," Emma corrected softly, but there was less resignation in her tone than before. James counted that as victory. Morning brought unexpected silence. The roaring wind had finally ceased its assault. James carefully opened the door to blinding brightness. Snow piled higher than his head, except where drifts had formed an unusual hollow near the entrance. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape under brilliant blue skies. Hope surged through him as he turned to Emma. "It's cleared. We have a chance now." But their celebration was short-lived. A quick inventory confirmed what they both knew. They lacked the supplies for a journey of any distance. Emma's injury, combined with her weakened state, made traveling through deep snow impossible. And the dropping temperature that followed. The storm's clearing would make staying in the deteriorating shack equally deadly without proper fuel. They faced an impossible choice. James could attempt to reach his family's cabin alone, a dangerous journey even for someone in full strength, or they could remain together and face almost certain death as their supplies dwindled to nothing. "You should go," Emma said, her face set with determination. "Take what food remains, travel fast, bring help if you can." James shook his head. "You wouldn't last 2 days here alone." "I won't last anyway if no one knows we're here," she countered. "This is the only logical choice." Logic, James thought bitterly, had little place in a situation where all options led to suffering. But he knew she was right. Their only hope lay in reaching his family, securing supplies, and returning before Emma succumbed to cold and hunger. "One day," he promised, preparing his small pack with precious little provisions. "I'll travel through the night if necessary. Just keep the fire going as long as possible." Emma nodded, her face pale but composed. As James secured his coat and gathered his rifle, she caught his sleeve with thin fingers. "If you don't make it back," she began. "I will," he cut her off, unable to bear the alternative. "But if you don't," she insisted, "know that you've already saved me. These days haven't been just prolonged dying. They've been living again. Remember that." The simplicity of her words struck James to his core. He impulsively took her cold hand in his, squeezing it once before releasing it. "Keep the fire going," he repeated. "I'll return." With that promise hanging between them, James stepped out into the brilliant, deadly beauty of the snow-covered mountain, knowing that 2 lives now depended on his ability to navigate a landscape transformed by winter's fury. The world had become a vast expanse of white, silent and unforgiving. James pushed forward, each step a battle against snow that reached above his knees. The clear sky that had seemed a blessing now revealed itself as a curse. Without clouds, the temperature plummeted, the kind of cold that burned lungs and froze eyelashes with every breath. He kept his gaze fixed on Settler's Ridge, the familiar outcropping that would guide him toward home if he could reach it before darkness fell. The sun blazed against the pristine snow, forcing James to squint as he trudged onward. His thoughts returned constantly to Emma, alone in that dilapidated shack with barely enough wood to last the day. Her face, gaunt yet somehow still beautiful, haunted him with each labored step. They had been strangers mere days ago, yet now her survival was entwined with his in a way he couldn't explain even to himself. By midday, exhaustion began to take its toll. James's muscles burned with effort, and sweat dampened his innermost layers despite the bitter cold. A dangerous combination that could quickly turn deadly if he stopped moving. The landmarks he knew so well in other seasons were transformed, buried under drifts that reshaped the entire mountainside. Twice, he found himself veering off course, wasting precious energy before correcting his path. "Keep moving," he muttered through chapped lips, his voice immediately swallowed by the vastness around him. One ridge at a time. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A lone wolf watching from a distant stand of pines. The animal made no move to approach, but its presence was a stark reminder of his vulnerability. Predators grew bold during harsh winters when hunger overrode their natural caution. James adjusted his rifle strap, making sure the weapon remained accessible, though using it would be a last resort. The sound might trigger an avalanche on these snow-laden slopes. As afternoon waned, clouds began to gather on the western horizon. Another storm brewing. James pushed himself harder, ignoring the protest of his muscles and the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He had given Emma the larger portion of their remaining food, a decision he couldn't bring himself to regret, even as hunger clouded his thoughts. The landscape grew steeper, forcing James to angle his path across treacherous slopes. One misstep here meant sliding hundreds of feet down into ravines now concealed by snow. He tested each foothold before committing his weight, progress slowing, to an agonizing crawl. The sun hung low now, casting long blue shadows across the snow. He would not reach home before nightfall. The realization settled like ice in his veins. A night exposed on the mountainside meant certain death, yet pushing on through darkness risked fatal missteps. James scanned his surroundings, searching for any possible shelter. To his left, perhaps half a mile distant, stood a familiar rock. Formation, Angel's Rest, they called it, for the wing-like protrusions of granite that sometimes offered protection from mountain winds. Changing course, James fought through deepening snow toward the rocks. Each step became an act of will, his body rebelling against the continued exertion. The cold had penetrated his layers now, fingers and toes losing sensation despite his constant movement. As he reached the first of the granite outcroppings, the wind picked up, driving ice crystals against his face with renewed fury. Angels. Rest revealed itself as both salvation and disappointment. The rock formation created a shallow cave, enough to block the wind, but nothing like the shelter he had hoped for. Still, it was his only option as darkness descended, and the temperature continued to drop. James gathered what meager branches he could find in the vicinity, his numb fingers struggling with the simplest tasks. The small fire he managed to start seemed pathetically inadequate against the encroaching night, its warmth extending barely an arm's length in any direction. James positioned himself as close as possible without risking his clothing, forcing himself to eat a handful of parched corn, even as his thoughts dwelled on Emma. Had she maintained her own fire? Was she huddled now in that dilapidated shack, watching her breath form clouds in the growing cold? Had he made the right choice in leaving? Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the necessity of feeding the feeble flames and the constant battle against the cold that seemed determined to claim him. Each time he dozed, Emma's face appeared in his dreams, sometimes as he had found her, frightened and starving, sometimes transformed by some future warmth and safety he could only imagine. By the time grey dawn lightened the eastern sky, James had made a decision that defied logic, but felt nonetheless certain. If, when he reached his family's cabin, he would not simply send help for Emma, he would find a way to bring her into their home, to make her part of their lives. The nature of this conviction confused him, even as its strength propelled him back to his feet, stamping life into numb limbs before setting out once more toward home. The morning brought marginally warmer temperatures, but thickening clouds that pressed low over the mountains. James oriented himself quickly, recognizing familiar terrain now that he had descended closer to the valley where the Miller homestead stood. Hope renewed his energy, pushing back against the exhaustion of the previous day's journey and night's poor rest. By mid-morning, smoke from a chimney became visible in the distance. Not his family's cabin yet, but the Coleman place. were old. Tom had settled 15 years earlier after giving up on striking it rich. The sight of human habitation after days in isolated struggle nearly brought James to his knees with relief. Old Tom himself was clearing a path from his door to his woodpile. When James approached, the older man's eyes widening with surprise beneath his frosted brows. "James Miller! Good God, boy, where'd you spring from?" Tom called out, leaning on his shovel as James trudged the final yards to his cabin. "Blackwater Mine area," James managed, his voice rough from disuse and cold. "Got caught in the storm." Tom ushered him inside, the warmth of the cabin hitting James like a physical blow after so many hours in the freezing mountain air. "Sit, sit," Tom insisted, pushing him toward a chair near the roaring fireplace. "Your folks been worried sick. Your pa and brother came by yesterday, asking if I'd seen hide or hair of you." Relief washed through James at the news. "They're out searching. Started as soon as the storm let up. Your pa was convinced you'd holed up somewhere to wait it out." Tom busied himself ladling stew from a pot hanging over the fire. "Smart. Man, your father." The food revived James enough to explain his situation, though not all of it. He mentioned finding a stranded traveler at the old Patterson claim, but kept Emma's gender to himself. Some instinct warned him to protect her identity, at least until he understood her circumstances better. "Need to borrow your mule," James said after finishing the stew. "And whatever supplies you can spare. My friend won't last another night without help." Tom studied him thoughtfully, years of mountain living having taught him when not to ask questions. "Mule's yours," he said finally. "And I've got some salt pork, flour, coffee. Not much else to spare this early in winter." "It's more than enough," James assured him, gratitude overwhelming him. "I'll make it right with you come spring." Tom waved away the promise. "Your pa pulled my foot from a bear trap 3 winters back. Reckon I still owe the Miller clan more than a mule loan and some victuals." Within the hour, James was mounted. On Tom's sturdy mule, saddlebags laden with precious supplies, renewed purpose driving him back toward his family's cabin. The animal picked its way carefully through the snow, far more efficiently than James had managed on foot. The clouds continued to thicken overhead, but James estimated he could reach home by early afternoon if they maintained this pace. The Miller homestead came into view just as light snow began to fall again, a sturdy log structure with smoke rising steadily from its stone chimney. James's throat tightened at the sight. Never had home looked so welcoming, yet his relief was tempered by the knowledge that Emma remained alone on the mountain, her survival hanging by the thinnest of threads. Rebecca spotted him first, her shout bringing Margaret running from the cabin, flour-covered hands raised to her mouth in disbelief. James had barely dismounted before his mother's arms wrapped around him, her body trembling with relief. "James!" she whispered, pulling back to examine his face with tear-filled eyes. "My boy, we feared—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm all right, Ma," he assured her, though his haggard appearance likely belied the words. "But there's someone who isn't, someone who needs our help." Rebecca was already leading the mule toward the barn. "Pa and Daniel are still out searching for you," she called over her shoulder. "East Ridge Way." Inside the cabin, warmth and familiar smells enveloped James, creating a momentary disconnection from the desperate days he'd just endured. The contrast between this sanctuary and the dilapidated shack where Emma waited struck him anew, sharpening his resolve. As James explained the situation to his mother and sister, he watched their expressions carefully. Margaret's face softened with concern when he described Emma's condition, but a flicker of something else, caution perhaps, showed when he mentioned bringing her to their home. A young woman, alone, claiming to be from Boston. Margaret questioned, her practical nature asserting itself, and she gave no explanation for her presence at an abandoned mine. "Ma, she was half-starved, injured and terrified," James replied, trying to keep frustration from his voice. "I didn't interrogate her." Rebecca, ever direct, asked the question their mother had avoided. "Is she in trouble, James? Running from something or someone?" The possibility had occurred to James during their forced confinement, but Emma's desperation had seemed too genuine for deception. "Whatever her circumstances, she'll die without help," he said firmly. "We can't leave her there." Margaret sighed, then nodded, her decision made. "Of course we can't. Robert and Daniel should return by nightfall. You'll rest until then. No arguments," she added as James began to protest. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. Tomorrow you'll take them to this woman." James wanted to argue, to insist they leave immediately, but sense prevailed. Another night alone for Emma was agonizing to contemplate, but attempting the journey with darkness falling and snow resuming would endanger everyone involved. He accepted his mother's wisdom with reluctance, allowing her to prepare a hot bath and fresh clothing, while Rebecca tended to the borrowed mule and unpacked the supplies he'd acquired from old Tom. By the time Robert and Daniel returned, alerted by the sight of strange tracks leading to their home, James had cleaned up and rested enough to present his case more coherently. His father listened intently, asking pointed questions about the location and Emma's condition, while Daniel prepared provisions for the rescue journey. "First light," Robert decided, his tone brooking no argument. "We leave at first light with the sled. Your mother will prepare the back bedroom and her medicines." He placed a weathered hand on James's shoulder. "You did well, son. Finding shelter in that storm, keeping both yourself and this woman alive, that took courage and sense." The praise warmed James, though he knew he'd made grave errors as well, ignoring the warning signs of the coming storm, straying too far from home so late in the season. Still, his father's words lifted some of the weight he'd carried down the mountain. That night, as the Miller family gathered around their table for the first time in days, the conversation revolved primarily around practical concerns: what supplies would be needed for the rescue, how they would transport an injured woman down treacherous slopes, what medical preparations Margaret should make. Yet beneath these discussions ran an undercurrent of unspoken questions about their soon-to-arrive guest. "What will happen to her afterward?" Rebecca finally asked as they finished their meal. "If she survives the journey, that is." The question hung in the air, none of them having considered beyond the immediate rescue. It was Daniel who answered, pragmatic as always. "Winter's set in for good now. No one's traveling through those passes until spring thaw, no matter their circumstances." He glanced at his parents. "Seems to me she'll be staying right here, whether that was her plan or not." "Then she'll earn her keep like anyone else," Robert said simply, "if she's able. We've room enough and food enough, the good Lord willing." James felt a peculiar relief at his father's words. The simplicity of mountain hospitality, offering what one had without expectation of return, was something he'd taken for granted until now. Seeing it extended to Emma without question confirmed what he'd told her in the shack. Out here they helped each other. It was how they survived. Sleep claimed him almost immediately that night, his body surrendering to exhaustion despite his churning thoughts. Yet even in dreams, Emma's face appeared to him, sometimes peaceful, sometimes frightened, always drawing him back toward the mountain where he'd left her. Dawn broke grey and cold, heavy clouds promising more snow before day's end. The Miller men worked efficiently by lantern light, securing the rescue sled to their sturdiest horse, packing supplies calculated to last several days if weather delayed their return. Margaret had prepared packets of dried herbs and tinctures, her worry evident in the detailed instructions she gave James for treating hypothermia and malnutrition. "Warm her slowly," she emphasized, pressing a flask of broth into his hands. "Small sips at first. Too much too quickly will do more harm than good. Rebecca added extra blankets to the sled, along with heated stones wrapped in flannel that would provide warmth for the journey home. Her practical nature showed in the details she considered: a screened section of the sled to block wind, leather straps to secure their passenger against jolts and jostling. As the men prepared to depart, Margaret embraced each of them in turn, ending with James. "Bring her safely home," she whispered against his cheek, something in her tone suggesting she understood more than she'd acknowledged about his concern for Emma. The journey up the mountain proved far easier with proper equipment and companions than James's desperate trek down had been. The horse pulled the empty sled efficiently through pathways that Daniel and Robert broke ahead of it, and the three men took turns leading. Still, progress slowed as they ascended steeper terrain, and the promised snow began falling in earnest by mid-morning. "Will we reach her before nightfall?" James asked, anxiety sharpening his voice as he watched the thickening snowfall obscure distant landmarks. Robert studied the sky with experienced eyes. "Not a full blizzard coming, just steady snow. We'll make it." James guided them unerringly toward the abandoned mine, his recent journey having etched the route in his memory despite the transformed landscape. As they approached the final ridge separating them from the Patterson claim, a plume of smoke became visible, faint but undeniable. "She's still alive," James breathed, relief washing through him. She kept the fire going. The shack looked even more dilapidated in daylight than James remembered, half buried in snow, with its sagging roof bearing a dangerous weight of white. The three men approached cautiously, Robert signaling for Daniel to circle around the back in case of trouble, a precaution that James found unnecessary but didn't protest. "Hello, the cabin," Robert called out as they neared the door. No response came from within, increasing James's anxiety. He moved forward quickly, brushing accumulated snow from the entrance. "Emma, it's James. I've brought help." The door creaked open at his touch, revealing the dim interior. For a heart-stopping moment, James thought the cabin empty, the fire nothing but smoldering embers. Then movement caught his eye. Emma had pressed herself into the far corner, a makeshift weapon clutched in trembling hands. Recognition dawned slowly in her eyes. "You came back," she whispered, disbelief evident in her voice. "I promised I would," James replied simply, moving toward her. Behind him, Robert entered the shack, his experienced gaze taking in both Emma's condition and the deteriorating shelter in one comprehensive look. The change in Emma over just 2 days shocked James. Her already gaunt face had hollowed further, dark circles emphasizing eyes too large in her pale face. She had clearly used the last of the wood, keeping a minimal fire alive, and the cold had settled into the shack, stealing what little strength she had left. "This is my father, Robert Miller," James said gently, kneeling beside her. "And my brother. Daniel is outside. We've come to take you to our home." Emma's gaze shifted to Robert, wariness evident in her posture, despite her obvious weakness. The older man removed his hat respectfully, his voice gentle as he addressed her. "Miss Thompson, my son tells me you've had a difficult time. We've brought a sled and provisions to transport you safely down the mountain if you're willing to. Come with us." Something in Robert's manner, the careful distance he maintained, the respect in his tone, seemed to reassure Emma. She lowered the crude weapon, a piece of wood with a nail driven through it that would have done little against any real threat. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Then you'll come with us," Robert said simply. "My wife has prepared a place for you." Daniel appeared in the doorway, having completed his circuit of the shack. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Emma, whether at her condition or her youth, James couldn't tell. Without comment, Daniel began gathering what few possessions Emma had, wrapping her threadbare blanket around a small bundle that included her dented cup and broken knife. Robert directed the evacuation with quiet efficiency, sending Daniel to prepare the sled while he and James carefully helped Emma to her feet. She swayed dangerously, her injured leg barely supporting her weight, and James instinctively swept her into his arms. She felt frighteningly light, as if the days alone had consumed what little substance she had left. "I can walk," she protested weakly, though her body betrayed her as she sagged against him. "Save your strength," James told her, carrying her toward the door. "The journey home will be challenge enough." Outside, Daniel had prepared the sled with meticulous care, creating a nest of blankets around the heated stones. Robert helped James settle Emma into this makeshift bed, tucking coverings around her thin frame before securing the straps that would prevent her from being thrown out on rough terrain. "Some broth first," James insisted, retrieving his mother's flask and helping Emma take small sips of the warm liquid. The effect was immediate. Color returned faintly to her cheeks, and her trembling subsided slightly. As they prepared to depart, Emma's gaze returned to the shack where she had nearly died. "My journal," she said suddenly, trying to rise. "I left my journal under the floorboard." Daniel was closest and ducked back inside without question. He returned moments later with a small leather-bound book, its edges worn smooth with handling. The relief on Emma's face as he tucked it securely beside her spoke volumes about its importance. With all preparations complete, the small party began their careful descent. Robert led the horse, choosing the gentlest path possible, while Daniel scouted ahead for obstacles hidden beneath the snow. James walked beside the sled, one hand resting on its edge where Emma could see it, a silent reassurance that he remained near. The snow continued falling steadily, limiting visibility and adding to the challenges of their journey. Progress was necessarily slow, each dip and rise negotiated with extreme caution to prevent jarring their fragile passenger. Emma drifted between consciousness and sleep, the warmth of the sled and the gentle motion sometimes lulling her despite the circumstances. During one of her wakeful periods, as they paused to rest the horse, she caught James's hand. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice slightly stronger after the broth and rest. "You could have sent others. You didn't have to return yourself." The question caught James off guard, though he realized she was right. He could have remained at the cabin recovering while his father and brother undertook the rescue. The truth was, he hadn't even considered that option. "I made a promise," he said finally, aware that his father and brother could hear, though they pretended absorption in adjusting harnesses. "To you and to myself." Something flickered in Emma's eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or something deeper that James couldn't name. She released his hand, but maintained his gaze for a moment longer before settling back into the blankets. As they continued downward, the landscape gradually transformed from steep, rocky slopes to the gentler contours of the valley. The Miller homestead appeared in the distance by late afternoon, smoke rising steadily from its chimney against the gathering dusk. James felt Emma tense beside him as the cabin came fully into view, her hand clutching the edge of the blanket. "It's all right," he assured her, understanding her apprehension. "My mother and sister are waiting. You're safe now." The word "safe" seemed to affect Emma deeply, her eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. She blinked them away quickly, composing herself as they approached the final stretch toward the cabin. Margaret and Rebecca were watching from the porch, having spotted their approach from afar. As the men guided the sled into the cleared yard, both women moved forward, Rebecca helping to steady the horse, while Margaret went directly to Emma's side, her healer's eyes assessing their guest's condition. "Welcome to our home, Miss Thompson," Margaret said warmly, helping to unbuckle the straps securing Emma to the sled. "I'm Margaret Miller, and this is my daughter Rebecca. We've prepared a warm room and hot food for you." Emma attempted to respond, but seemed overwhelmed by the sudden presence of so many people after her isolation. James stepped in smoothly, lifting her from the sled with care. "She's exhausted, Ma, and her right leg is injured. Some food and rest first, then talk later." Margaret nodded, leading the way into the cabin, where the fire blazed welcomingly in the stone hearth. The family had prepared well in the men's absence. The back bedroom was warmed by heated bricks beneath the feather mattress, extra quilts folded at the foot of the bed, and a steaming basin of water, ready for washing away the grime of days spent in the dilapidated shack. James carried Emma through to this prepared sanctuary, setting her gently on the edge of the bed, while Margaret brought a bowl of broth, thicker and more substantial than what they had offered on the mountain. "Small sips," Margaret instructed, her tone professional yet kind. "Your body needs to remember how to accept nourishment again." Rebecca appeared with a clean nightgown and soft towels. "We should help her wash and change before she rests," she told the men pointedly. "You three can see to the horse and equipment." It was a clear dismissal, one that James accepted despite his reluctance to leave Emma's side. Something in these past days had forged a connection between them that defied rational explanation. Still, propriety demanded he withdraw, while the women tended to Emma's immediate needs. In the main room, Robert was already stoking the fire, while Daniel removed his snow-covered outer garments. Neither man commented on James's obvious concern for their guest, though an understanding glance passed between father and son. "She'll need time," Robert said simply, pouring coffee for each of them. "To heal and to trust. Whatever brought her to that mountain alone isn't something she'll speak of easily." James nodded, warming his hands around the steaming mug. "She said she came west with a mining company as a teacher, but stayed when they abandoned the camp." "No family looking for her?" Daniel asked, the practical question one that had occurred to James as well. "She mentioned arrangements with her cousin in Denver, but circumstances changed. Her words, not mine." Robert considered this as he settled into his chair by the fire. "Well, circumstances have changed again. Winter's upon us properly now. Whatever her story, she's here until spring thaw, at least." An hour passed before Rebecca emerged from the back bedroom, carrying a basin of used water. "She's asleep," she reported, emptying the basin and fetching clean water for washing. "Ma's sitting with her a while, watching for fever. She's in a bad way, James. Starved half to death, and that leg might be infected." The news sobered all. Of them, mountain winters claimed many lives, even among the strong and well-provisioned. For someone in Emma's weakened state, survival remained uncertain despite their rescue. Margaret joined them shortly, her expression grave as she accepted the coffee Daniel poured for her. She managed a little broth and some tea with honey, but couldn't stay awake long. Her body's shutting down non-essential functions to preserve strength. "Will she survive?" James asked directly, needing honesty more than comfort. His mother considered the question with professional detachment. Her youth is in her favor. No signs of frostbite, thankfully, though that's a near miracle given conditions in that shack. The leg concerns me most. There's definitely infection. I've applied a poultice and will watch it closely." The family fell silent, each contemplating the stranger now resting under their roof and the circumstances that had brought her there. Finally, Rebecca voiced what they were all considering. She had a journal hidden beneath the floorboards. Wouldn't let it out of her sight, not even when we were helping her wash. Robert shook his head slightly. "That's her business, Becca. We all have things we hold private. I'm just saying there's more to her story than being abandoned by a mining company," Rebecca persisted. "A proper Boston lady doesn't end up alone in a mountain shack by accident." "Whatever her past," Margaret said firmly, "she's our responsibility now. The Lord brought her to us through James, and we'll care for her as we would any soul in need. The discussion ended there, though James knew his sister's curiosity wouldn't be so easily satisfied. Rebecca had always been the family member most, intent on knowing all details, on understanding motivations and causes. It was part of her intelligence, but sometimes led to friction when others preferred discretion. As evening deepened into night, the family settled into their normal routines. Daniel checking the livestock one final time, Rebecca preparing dough for morning bread, Robert reading aloud from the family Bible before bed. James found himself constantly aware of the closed door to the back bedroom, straining to hear any sound that might indicate Emma needed assistance. When the others had retired, James remained by the fire, sleep eluding him, despite his physical exhaustion. Margaret found him there when she rose to check on their patient in the early hours of morning. "You should rest," she admonished gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than most could have, bringing her safely down that mountain." "I keep thinking of her alone in that shack," James admitted. "If I hadn't been caught in the storm, if I hadn't chosen that direction to check my traps, then the Lord would have found another way," Margaret finished firmly. "Or perhaps her time would have come, as it comes to us all eventually. Second-guessing Providence leads nowhere useful, James." He nodded, accepting his mother's wisdom, even as his mind continued to circle the improbable series of events that had brought Emma Thompson into their lives. How is she now? Sleeping naturally, which is good, fevers present but not dangerously high. Margaret studied her son's face in the dying firelight. "You feel responsible for her?" It wasn't a question, but James answered anyway. "I found her. I promised to return. And you kept that promise admirably." Margaret paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But James, we know nothing about this young woman beyond what little she's told you. Compassion is godly, but attachment, without understanding, may lead to difficulties." The gentle warning surprised James, who hadn't considered his concern in those terms. Was he becoming attached to Emma? The idea seemed premature. They were effectively strangers thrown together by circumstance. Yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, the relief he'd experienced seeing smoke still rising from the shack chimney. "I just want her to recover," he said finally, "to have a chance at whatever life she sought by coming west." Margaret seemed satisfied with this answer, patting his arm before returning to her own bed. James remained by the fire a while longer, contemplating his mother's words and the uncertain future that now included Emma Thompson, a woman who had entered their lives as mysteriously as the winter storms that transformed their mountain home. Days passed in the Miller household as Emma drifted between feverish sleep and brief moments of clarity. Margaret rarely left her side, applying cool cloths to her forehead and coaxing herbal remedies between her parched lips. The infection in Emma's leg had indeed worsened during those final hours alone in the shack, angry red streaks now extending upward from the original wound. "It's fighting back," Margaret told James when he inquired about Emma's condition on the third evening after the rescue. "The willow bark tea is bringing the fever down some, but that leg..." She shook her head, the gesture conveying more concern than words could express. James lingered in the doorway of the sick room, watching Emma's restless sleep. In these unguarded moments, her face appeared younger, the worry lines that had seemed permanently etched between her brows momentarily smoothed away. Yet even in sleep, one hand remained curled protectively around her journal, which never left her side. "She talks sometimes," Rebecca said, appearing silently beside her brother with fresh linens in her arms. "When the fever's highest." "Nothing. That makes sense. Just fragments. Names mostly. Someone called Elizabeth and a man's name I couldn't quite catch." James frowned. "You shouldn't be listening to her fever talk, Becca. It's private." His sister shrugged, unrepentant. I'm not prying, just observing. There's a difference. She pushed past him into the room, her voice changing to a gentler tone as she helped their mother change the bedding without disturbing their patient more than necessary. Outside, winter had settled fully onto the valley. Snow fell almost daily, accumulating in deep drifts that Daniel and Robert cleared methodically to maintain paths to the barn and woodshed. James threw himself into these physical tasks with unusual vigor, as if the exertion might dispel the constant concern that had taken residence in his mind. "You're working yourself harder than the horses," Daniel commented one morning as they hauled firewood to the cabin. "The girl's not going anywhere. Ma will see her through." James secured another log under his arm without responding. Daniel was right, of course. Their mother's skill with herbal remedies was renowned throughout the scattered homesteads of Pine Ridge. If anyone could save Emma from the infection ravaging her system, it was Margaret Miller. Yet as another day passed with no improvement, even Margaret's steadfast confidence began to waver. "We need stronger medicine," she admitted to Robert in a hushed conversation that James overheard from the doorway. "The kind Doc Wilson keeps, locked in his cabinet." Robert's weathered face grew grave. "Wilson's place is 3 days hard riding in good conditions. In this snow..." 4, maybe 5, Margaret finished, her hands twisting in her apron. "And I don't know if she has. That long, Robert? The infection's in her blood now." James stepped fully into the room then, decision already made. "I'll go. First light tomorrow." His parents exchanged a glance, weighted with unspoken concerns. "Son, you've just recovered from your own ordeal," Robert began. "All the more reason." "I should go," James countered. "I know what supplies we need, and I'm the youngest besides Rebecca. I'll travel fastest." "It's dangerous," Margaret said softly. "The pass to Wilson's settlement. We'll be snow-covered, but still passable if I leave tomorrow," James finished firmly. "The new storm isn't due for 3 days, according to old Tom's barometer." Robert studied his son's determined expression, before nodding slowly. "Take the bay mare. She's sure-footed in snow and has the most endurance." He moved to the family desk, pulling out a piece of precious paper. "Your mother will make a list of exactly what we need. No detours, no delays. You get those medicines and return immediately." The preparations consumed the remainder of the day, plotting the safest route using Robert's hand-drawn maps, packing provisions that would sustain James without weighing down the horse, preparing the specially designed saddlebags that would protect the medicines during the return journey. As evening settled over the cabin, James found himself drawn once more to Emma's bedside. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle that cast flickering shadows across the walls. Margaret had finally been persuaded to rest, leaving Rebecca to watch over their patient for the first part of the night. "She's been quieter the past hour," Rebecca reported, relinquishing her chair beside the bed. "No more fever talk, but her skin's still burning." James nodded, taking the chair his sister vacated. "Get some sleep, Becca. I'll sit with her a while." Rebecca hesitated in the doorway, studying her brother with unusual intensity. "You barely know this woman, James, yet you'd risk the winter pass to Wilson's for her medicines." It wasn't quite a question, but James felt compelled to answer nonetheless. "I found her. That makes her my responsibility." "Does it?" Rebecca's voice held no judgment, merely curiosity. "Or is there something more to it? Something about her that draws you?" James turned his attention to Emma's sleeping form, uncomfortable with his sister's perceptiveness. "Go to bed, Becca. Dawn comes early." Left alone with Emma, James found himself studying her face, searching for clues to the mystery she presented. Who was Elizabeth? What circumstances had separated her from the cousin in Denver? And most puzzling of all, what had compelled her to remain alone at an abandoned mine site with winter approaching? As if sensing his scrutiny, Emma stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Recognition dawned slowly in her fever-bright gaze. "James," she whispered, the word barely audible. "I'm here," he replied, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" A ghost of a smile touched her cracked lips. Truthfully, like death warmed over. The unexpected humor surprised a soft laugh from James. "Well, your spirit's improving, at least." Emma's smile faded as she tried to shift position, a gasp of pain escaping her. "The leg?" James nodded grimly. "It's infected. My mother's been treating it, but..." He hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal about her condition. "But it's not working," Emma finished, surprising him with her lucidity despite the fever. "I can feel it spreading, the heat of it." James reached for the water cup on the bedside table, helping her take small sips before responding. "I'm leaving at first light, riding to Wilson's settlement to get stronger medicines." Emma's eyes widened. "The pass is dangerous in winter. It's still early enough in the season. I'll make it through." James set the cup down, meeting her worried gaze steadily. "You saved my life by sharing your shelter during the storm. I won't stand by while you fight this alone." Emma turned her face away, but not before James glimpsed the wetness in her eyes. "You've all done too much already. Your family would do the same for anyone," James assured her, though he knew this wasn't entirely true. The journey he planned to undertake carried real risk, beyond what his parents would typically sanction for a stranger. Yet they had raised no serious objections, perhaps sensing his determination. When Emma looked back at him, her expression had changed. Resolve replacing vulnerability. "My journal," she said, her hand tightening on the leather-bound book at her side. "If the fever worsens while you're gone..." "Don't talk that way," James interrupted, uncomfortable with the direction of her thoughts. "Please," Emma insisted, her fingers working at the leather cord that kept the journal closed. "I need to show you something in case." Reluctantly, James watched as she opened the book with trembling hands, turning to a specific page near the back. A folded document had been pressed between the pages, which she extracted with careful movements. "If I die," she said, her voice steadying with the importance of her words, "this must reach my cousin in Denver. Elizabeth Harding. There's an address written inside." James took the document with a sense of foreboding, noting the official seal visible even through the folded paper. "What is this?" Emma closed her eyes briefly. Whether from fatigue or reluctance to explain, James couldn't tell. "Proof," she said finally, "of what really happened at Blackwater Mine, why the company abandoned it so suddenly." Before James could ask more, a fit of coughing overtook Emma, the force of it shaking her frail body. He quickly helped her drink more water, noting with alarm the heat radiating from her skin, where his hand supported her shoulders. "You should rest," he said once the coughing subsided. "Save your strength." Emma nodded weakly, her burst of energy clearly depleted, but her fingers caught his wrist as he moved to return the document to her journal. "Keep it," she whispered. "Hidden, not here." The urgency in her voice gave James pause. He tucked the paper inside his shirt, nodding his understanding. "I'll guard it, and I'll return with the medicine you need." Relief visibly washed over Emma's features as she settled back against the pillows. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes already closing as exhaustion reclaimed her. James remained at her bedside until her breathing deepened into sleep, troubled by this new development. The document weighed against his chest like a physical burden, its contents unknown, yet clearly significant enough that Emma feared for its safety even here. What had she witnessed at Blackwater Mine that required such secrecy, and who might be seeking to prevent its revelation? When Margaret came to relieve him in the small hours of the morning, James said nothing of his conversation with Emma or the document now hidden in the lining of his coat. Some instinct warned him to honor Emma's caution, at least until he understood more fully what danger might be attached to her proof. Preparations for the journey resumed before dawn, the family moving with quiet efficiency in the grey light. Filtering through frosted windows, Daniel helped saddle the bay mare while Robert double-checked the route James would take, marking areas of potential avalanche danger that would need to be circumvented. 3 days to Wilson's if the weather holds, Robert reminded his son as they stood in the barn's relative warmth. Another 3 back. Any sign of a major storm brewing, you find shelter and wait it out. The girl needs medicine, but she needs it delivered by a living man. James secured the last of his provisions, the weight of Emma's document still pressing against his chest. "I'll be careful, Pa, but I won't delay unless absolutely necessary." Margaret appeared in the barn doorway, a small package wrapped in oilcloth in her hands. "My final list of what we need," she said, pressing it into James's gloved hand, "and some dried apple tarts for the journey. Doc Wilson can be stubborn about parting with his stronger medicines. Tell him." She hesitated, uncharacteristic, uncertainty crossing her face. "Tell him I wouldn't ask if there were any other way." The gravity of her words settled over James. His mother, skilled healer that she was, rarely admitted the limits of her abilities. That she did so now spoke volumes about Emma's deteriorating condition. Final goodbyes were brief. The Millers were not given to emotional displays, and the urgency of the mission overshadowed personal concerns. As James mounted the mare and turned her toward the path that would lead to the mountain pass, he caught sight of a pale face at the window of Emma's sick room. Rebecca stood there, her expression unreadable as she raised one hand in farewell. The first day's travel progressed smoothly, the mare picking her way confidently through familiar terrain despite the snow cover. James pushed on longer than he'd initially planned, taking advantage of clear weather and a bright half-moon that illuminated the trail even after sunset. He made camp in a small cave he and Daniel had used during hunting trips, building a small fire that provided warmth without, creating enough smoke to be visible from a distance. As the flames cast dancing shadows across the rock walls, James finally withdrew Emma's document from its hiding place. His conscience troubled him briefly. Reading another's private papers felt like a violation of trust. Yet Emma herself had entrusted this to him, and understanding its contents might prove crucial if her condition worsened in his absence. Carefully unfolding the paper, James discovered it was not one document, but 3. A letter written in a delicate feminine hand, a notarized statement bearing an official territorial seal, and a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be mining tunnels, with certain areas circled and annotated. The letter, addressed to Elizabeth Harding in Denver, confirmed what Emma had briefly mentioned about teaching for the mining company. But it revealed much more, that she had been hired not merely as an instructor for workers' children, but specifically at the request of the mine's chief engineer, Arthur Harding, Elizabeth's husband and Emma's cousin by marriage. "Dearest Elizabeth, I pray this reaches you safely, though I fear what news of Arthur's death may have already come to your door. The official report will claim cave-in or accident, a tragic but common fate in these mountains. This falsehood I cannot allow to stand, not when I witnessed with my own eyes the confrontation between your husband and Mr. Sullivan the night before Arthur's body was discovered. Arthur confided in me his discoveries regarding the Western Tunnel. How Sullivan had ordered support beams of inferior quality installed, despite Arthur's protests that they endangered the men. When proof emerged that Sullivan had pocketed the difference from the supplies budget, Arthur threatened exposure unless changes were made immediately. That night, I heard raised voices from the office and observed Sullivan and 2 men I did not recognize follow Arthur toward the mine entrance. When Arthur failed to appear for breakfast, Sullivan himself led the search party that discovered his body beneath a supposed collapse that showed signs of deliberate demolition to my untrained but observant eye. The enclosed map marks where this occurred, and the statement from Mr. Davis, the night watchman, who also witnessed suspicious activity but fears coming forward publicly, should provide enough evidence for the territorial authorities to investigate properly. I remain at the abandoned site, though the company has recalled all other personnel, claiming the vein has played out. My fear of traveling alone with this knowledge, when Sullivan's men still frequent the nearby settlement, has kept me here longer than prudence dictates. I will attempt to reach you when the first thaw makes travel possible. Your devoted cousin, Emma James, refolded the documents with unsteady hands, the implications becoming horribly clear. Emma possessed evidence of murder, the deliberate killing of a mine engineer by his superior to cover up dangerous cost-cutting and embezzlement. No wonder she had remained hidden at the abandoned mine, rather than risking travel to Denver, while Sullivan's associates might be watching the trails. The knowledge transformed James's understanding of Emma's situation entirely. She wasn't simply a stranded teacher, but a witness to corporate corruption and murder, isolating herself out of legitimate fear for her safety. The document he carried wasn't merely important to Emma personally. It represented justice for her murdered cousin-in-law and potentially protection for future miners who might otherwise fall victim to the same dangerous conditions. Sleep eluded James that night as he considered the ramifications. Did Sullivan know Emma possessed this evidence? Was he actively searching for her, or did he believe the approaching winter and Emma's isolation would resolve the threat she posed without his intervention? And most troublingly, if Sullivan had connections throughout the mining communities of the territory, could his influence extend to Wilson's settlement, where James now headed? Morning brought no clarity, only renewed determination to complete his mission swiftly. James secured the documents inside his coat again, erased all signs of his camp, and set out as first light broke across the snow-covered peaks. The pass lay ahead, a narrow traverse between towering cliffs that would lead him to the next valley and eventually to Wilson's settlement beyond. The mare sensed his urgency, maintaining a steady pace despite the increasingly difficult terrain. By midday, they had reached the entrance to the pass itself, a forbidding corridor where wind-driven snow had created unstable drifts along the edges. James dismounted, deciding to lead the horse through the most treacherous sections rather than risking a misstep under his weight. The wind howled between the rock walls, creating an eerie moan that set James's nerves on edge. Every few minutes he paused, listening intently for any sound that might indicate an approaching avalanche or rock slide. The mare's ears flicked nervously, her nostrils flaring at some scent carried on the bitter wind. They were halfway through the pass when James first noticed the tracks. Horse hooves partially filled with fresh snow, but clearly made since the last major snowfall. Someone else had traversed the pass recently, heading in the same direction as James. In itself, this wasn't unusual. Wilson's settlement was the largest community within 3 days' ride. Traders, trappers, and travelers all used this route when weather permitted. Yet something about the tracks troubled him. They appeared and disappeared irregularly, sometimes visible in sheltered areas, sometimes completely obscured by drifting snow. James found himself scanning the cliff edges above with increased frequency, an inexplicable sense of being watched prickling at his awareness. By late afternoon, the pass widened gradually, indicating they had successfully navigated its most dangerous section. James remounted, allowing the mare to pick up her pace now that the footing was more secure. The tracks he'd been following seemed to have vanished completely, either covered by fresh snow or diverging onto a trail he hadn't noticed. As twilight approached, James began searching for suitable shelter for the night. The Western Valley opened before him, its scattered pine forests offering better protection than the exposed slopes behind. He directed the mare toward a dense stand of trees, intending to make camp where the evergreen canopy would block the worst of any overnight snowfall. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the mountain silence. James reacted instinctively, throwing himself from the saddle, just as a second shot kicked up snow where he had been riding moments before. The startled mare reared, nearly trampling him before bolting several yards ahead. Crouching low, James drew his own rifle, eyes scanning the tree line for the source of the attack. Nothing moved in the gathering darkness. No telltale smoke from a rifle barrel, no shifting shadow to indicate a hidden assailant. Whoever had fired those shots knew these mountains well enough to change positions immediately after revealing their location. James whistled softly, relieved when the mare responded by stopping her panicked flight. He needed those medical supplies, couldn't risk the horse running off entirely. Staying low, he moved diagonally toward a cluster of boulders that would provide better cover, mentally calculating the shooter's likely position based on the angle of the shots. A third shot splintered bark from a tree trunk inches from his head. James dove behind the nearest boulder, heart pounding. The attack was no accident, no hunter mistaking him for game. Someone was deliberately trying to kill him and showing enough skill that their continued failure suggested they might be toying with him, herding him in a specific direction rather than ending the confrontation quickly. As full darkness descended, James weighed his options. Making a run for the horse in open terrain invited a clean shot from his hidden attacker. Remaining in place until morning meant risking hypothermia without proper shelter or fire. Attempting to circle back and outflank the shooter might work, but would cost precious hours in his journey to obtain medicine for Emma. Emma. The thought of her lying fevered in his family's cabin, deteriorating with each passing hour, hardened his resolve. The documents hidden in his coat suddenly seemed to burn against his chest. Was this attack connected to Sullivan and Blackwater Mine? Had someone tracked Emma to the Miller home, observed James's departure, and guessed his destination? The questions multiplied without answers, but one certainty remained. He could not afford to fail in his mission, not with Emma's life hanging in the balance. James checked his rifle, confirmed his remaining ammunition, and began a careful retreat toward a different cluster of rocks that would provide stepping stones back to the mare without exposing him completely. The night had become his ally now, the darkness concealing his movements as he slipped from shadow to shadow. The shooter would be similarly hindered, forced to guess at James's location rather than tracking him visually. When he judged himself, positioned correctly, James removed his hat, balanced it on the end of his rifle, and slowly raised it above his current shelter. No shot came. Either the attacker had lost track of him, or was too experienced to fall for such an obvious ploy. James waited several more minutes, listening for any sound of movement in the surrounding forest. Nothing but the soft sigh of wind through pine branches and the distant snort of the increasingly restless mare. Deciding to risk it, James sprinted for the horse, keeping his body low and his path unpredictable. He reached the mare without incident, swinging into the saddle in one fluid motion before urging her into a gallop toward the denser forest ahead. If the shooter remained, they made no further attempt to stop his escape. James rode hard for nearly an hour before allowing the mare to slow to a sustainable pace. His mind raced faster than the horse's hooves, attempting to make sense of the ambush. If Sullivan's men were responsible, how had they known to watch the pass? Was Emma's presence at the Miller home common knowledge in Pine Ridge? Or was this attack unrelated, perhaps the work of outlaws who preyed on solitary travelers in these remote regions? Finding a suitable campsite now became a complex calculation. He needed somewhere defensible, with clear sightlines that would prevent a second ambush, yet sheltered enough to build a fire without creating a beacon for pursuers. Eventually, James selected a small hollow encircled by large pines. with a rock face at its back that would reflect heat from a carefully shielded fire. Sleep came fitfully, his rest interrupted by the smallest sounds. A branch cracking under the weight of snow, an owl's cry piercing the darkness, the mare shifting restlessly where he'd secured her nearby. Each disturbance brought James fully awake, rifle in hand, senses straining for any hint of approaching danger. Dawn arrived without further incident, grey light filtering through the pine boughs to reveal a world transformed by overnight snowfall. James broke camp quickly, erasing all signs of his presence before continuing west toward Wilson's settlement. The fresh snow concerned him. It would slow his progress significantly while concealing any tracks his attacker might have left behind. The day passed in tense vigilance, James constantly scanning his surroundings as the mare navigated increasingly unfamiliar terrain. By late afternoon, thin wisps of smoke became visible in the distance, the first indication of Wilson's settlement. Just beyond the next ridge, relief mingled with caution as James approached. If Sullivan had influence here, as Emma had feared, the settlement might harbor further dangers. Wilson's settlement had grown substantially since James's last visit, 2 years earlier. What had been a cluster of crude cabins around a trading post had expanded to include a proper street lined with more permanent structures, a saloon, a general store, a smithy, and most importantly, for James's purposes, Doc Wilson's combined residence and medical office. James approached cautiously, noting the curious glances from locals as he rode down the settlement's single street. A stranger arriving alone during early winter naturally attracted attention, but something in these stares felt more pointed than mere curiosity. He dismounted outside the doctor's building, securing the mare before removing Margaret's list from his pocket. Doc Wilson himself answered James's knock, a barrel-chested man with a shock of white hair and perpetually ruddy complexion. Recognition dawned in his eyes immediately. "Young Miller, isn't it? Robert's boy." He ushered James inside without waiting for confirmation. "Must be serious business bringing you through the pass this time of year." James nodded, producing Margaret's carefully written list. "We have a woman at our homestead. Fever from an infected leg wound. My mother's. Tried everything in her power, but..." Wilson scanned the list, his expression growing grave. "Quinine, laudanum, proper surgical instruments. This isn't just a simple infection you're describing, son." "No, sir. The infection's in her blood now. My mother fears gangrene if we can't bring the fever down soon." The doctor moved to a locked cabinet, selecting various bottles and packages as he spoke. "Your mother's not one to exaggerate medical concerns. If Margaret Miller says it's dire, then it surely is." He paused, studying James more carefully. "You look done in yourself. When did you last sleep properly?" James evaded the question, focusing instead on the supplies being assembled. "Will you have everything we need?" Wilson nodded slowly. "Most of it, short on quinine. Supply wagon from Denver's late this month, but I can spare enough for your purposes." He continued gathering items, his movements deliberate. "This woman. Not a Miller, you say?" Something in the doctor's tone put James on alert. "A traveler. Got stranded when winter came early. We found her half-starved at the old Patterson claim near Blackwater." Wilson's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their task. "Blackwater mine, eh? Thought that whole operation shut down months ago when the vein played out." "It did," James agreed cautiously, watching the doctor's reaction. "She was a teacher for the mining company, got left behind somehow." A teacher. Wilson sealed a package of surgical instruments in oilcloth, his tone carefully neutral. "Wouldn't happen to be a Miss Thompson, would it? Boston lady, dark hair, on the younger side?" The question sent a chill through James that had nothing to do with the winter cold outside. "You know her?" Wilson sighed heavily, gesturing for James to take a seat at the small table that dominated his front room. She came through here last spring. Treated her for a nasty cough. Nothing serious, just traveling in bad weather. She was heading to Blackwater then, mentioned being related to their chief engineer. He paused, studying James's face. Word came back later that this engineer, Harding was his name, died in a mine collapse. Bad business. James maintained a neutral expression, though his pulse quickened. We didn't get many details about her circumstances. She was in pretty bad shape when we found her. I'd imagine so. Wilson finished packaging the medicines, securing them in a watertight container suitable for travel. There's been men through, here asking after her. Mining company men, supposedly, though they didn't strike me as the office type, said she might have company documents that needed returning. When? James asked sharply, unable to hide his concern. When were these men here? Wilson's shrewd eyes narrowed slightly. First ones came through about 2 months back, asked at every house and business in the settlement. Most recent pair passed through just 3 days ago, heading toward Pine Ridge Way. He pushed the container of medicines across the table. You should know, son, these weren't men I'd want finding a woman alone. The confirmation of James's worst fears nearly made him forget the primary purpose of his journey. Emma's documents weren't merely important. They were actively being sought by men who likely intended to silence her permanently, just as they had silenced her cousin's husband. Is there another route back to Pine Ridge? James asked, already calculating how quickly he could return. One that avoids the main pass? Wilson stroked his beard thoughtfully. There's the old trapper's trail that runs north of the pass. Longer by half a day at least, and rougher going, but less likely to be watched, if that's your concern. He stood, moving to a crude map pinned to his wall. I can mark it for you. As the doctor traced the alternative route with his finger, James weighed his options. The standard pass was faster, but likely watched after yesterday's ambush. The trapper's trail would be slower but safer, yet every hour of delay meant Emma's condition potentially worsening beyond recovery. The medicines, he said finally. How soon do they need to be administered? Wilson's expression grew somber. If the infection's as advanced as your mother suggests, every hour counts. Blood. Poisoning moves quickly once it takes hold. The decision crystallized in James's mind. I'll take the main pass, ride through the night if conditions allow. Wilson nodded, though concern lined his features. Then you'll need this as well. He reached into a drawer, withdrawing a revolver that he placed on the table. Better to have it and not need it. James stared at the weapon, understanding its implications. I have my rifle. A rifle's no good at close quarters or from horseback at speed, Wilson replied practically. Consider it a loan from an old friend of your father's. As James secured the medicines and reluctantly accepted the revolver, Wilson disappeared, briefly into his back room, returning with a small package. Food for your journey. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days. His voice dropped lower. And James, those men asking after Miss Thompson. They mentioned Blackwater, but they also specifically asked about the miller's place. Cold certainty settled in James's stomach. They know she's with us. Seems likely, Wilson agreed grimly. Which means your family could be in danger, not just you on this return journey. James stood, urgency propelling him toward the door. I need to leave immediately. Wilson didn't attempt to delay him, merely offering a final warning. Those mountains forgive no mistakes, son. A man riding too fast in darkness is as dead as one facing a bullet. Find the balance. Outside, the settlement had grown quieter as evening approached, most residents retreating to their homes as temperature dropped with the setting sun. James mounted quickly, adjusting his saddlebags to distribute the weight of the medical supplies. Evenly, the mare seemed to sense his tension, dancing sideways as he swung into the saddle. As he turned toward the eastern trail that would lead back to the pass, a flicker of movement caught his attention. a man watching from the shadowed doorway of the saloon, his stance suggesting more than casual interest in James's departure. When their eyes met briefly across the distance, the stranger turned abruptly back into the building. James urged the mare forward, knowing that returning to Pine Ridge now wasn't simply about delivering medicine. It was a race against opponents who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. Opponents who now knew exactly where to find Emma Thompson. The night stretched endlessly before James as he pushed the mare through the darkness, every sense alert for signs of pursuit. The mountain pass loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette barely visible against the star-filled sky. He had departed Wilson's settlement with the precious medicine secured in his saddlebags, but the doctor's warning echoed in his mind. Men were searching for Emma, and they now knew where to find her. Snow crunched beneath the mare's hooves, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. James paused frequently, listening for any hint that he wasn't alone on the trail. The revolver Wilson had pressed upon him sat heavy in his coat pocket, an unfamiliar weight that reminded him constantly of the danger at his back. By midnight, he had reached the entrance to the pass itself. Moonlight transformed the snow-covered landscape into a sea of silver and shadow, beautiful but treacherous. The mare snorted, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as James dismounted to lead her through the narrowest sections. Here, where towering cliffs pressed close on either side, was where he'd faced gunfire on his outward journey. If an ambush awaited, this would be the place. James moved forward cautiously, testing each step, eyes scanning the cliff edges for any movement. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft shuffle of the mare's hooves and his own measured breathing. Perhaps his attackers had abandoned their watch, believing he would choose the alternate route Wilson had suggested. Or perhaps they waited farther ahead, anticipating his caution at this most obvious ambush point. An hour passed without incident as James guided the mare deeper into the pass. The cliffs gradually widened, opening into a small plateau where he paused briefly to rest the horse and check his bearings against the stars. The worst of the pass lay behind them now, but the most difficult portion of the journey remained, descending the eastern slopes toward Pine Ridge Valley in darkness. Just as James prepared to mount again, a distant sound froze him in place. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, approaching from the direction of Wilson's settlement. Moving quickly, he led the mare into a cluster of boulders away from the trail. One, hand gently covering her nostrils to prevent a betraying nicker. Minutes later, 3 riders emerged from the western entrance to the pass, moving at a steady trot despite the dangerous terrain and limited visibility. Even from this distance, James could tell these weren't ordinary travelers. They rode with purpose, rifles clearly visible across their saddles, stopping periodically to examine the trail. Trackers following his prints in the snow with professional precision. The stranger he'd noticed watching from the saloon doorway must have alerted others to his departure. James weighed his options rapidly. Remaining hidden might allow the pursuers to pass, but if they were skilled enough to follow his tracks in moonlight, they would eventually discover where he'd left the trail. Fighting was out of the question. 3 against 1 in unfamiliar terrain were odds no sane man would accept. His only advantage lay in his intimate knowledge of the mountains between here and Pine Ridge. Waiting until the riders had moved just beyond his position, James led the mare carefully in the opposite direction, away from the main trail and toward a steep, narrow game path Daniel had discovered years earlier. Few outside the Miller family knew of its existence, and in darkness, his tracks might be missed by even the most experienced trackers if he moved carefully. The descent was agonizingly slow, each step measured to minimize noise and disturbance. To the snow, the mare, sensing his tension, followed with surprising delicacy despite her size. By the time dawn's first grey light appeared on the horizon, James had put considerable distance between himself and the main trail. though his progress toward home had been significantly delayed. With daylight came new challenges. His tracks would be clearly visible in fresh snow, and any pursuit would likely split up to cover multiple potential routes. James pushed on, forcing himself to maintain a careful pace despite the urge to rush, headlong toward home. The medicine he carried was Emma's only hope, and his family might well be in danger if Sullivan's men had indeed identified the Miller homestead as Emma's refuge. By midday, familiar landmarks appeared: Raven's Ridge to the north, the distinctive twin pines that marked the boundary of Old Tom's trapping grounds to the south. James allowed himself a moment of hope. If he maintained this pace, he could reach home by nightfall, perhaps earlier. That hope dimmed when he crested a small rise and spotted a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of Old Tom's cabin. Something about its density and color raised immediate alarm. This wasn't the controlled smoke of a cooking fire or heating stove. This was the thick, dark plume of a structure burning. Caution warred with concern as James altered his course toward the Coleman place. Old Tom had shown him nothing but kindness during their encounter days earlier, lending his mule and sharing precious supplies without hesitation. If trouble had found the old trapper, James couldn't simply ride past without investigating. As he drew closer, the extent of the destruction became apparent. Tom's cabin lay in smoldering ruins, the heat still intense enough to have melted the surrounding snow into a muddy ring. Of Tom himself, there was no sign, though his mule, the same animal James had borrowed, stood trembling in the remains of its lean-to shelter, miraculously unharmed. James approached cautiously, rifle ready, scanning the area for any movement. The fire appeared to have burned itself out naturally rather than being extinguished, suggesting it had raged unchecked for hours. A careful circuit of the cabin's perimeter revealed no body, but the trampled snow told a story of multiple horses and men present recently. "Tom?" James called softly, not expecting an answer but unable to leave without trying. "Only the wind," replied, carrying the acrid scent of charred wood. Moving to the mule, James noticed something he had missed in his initial survey: a crude message carved into the wooden post of the lean-to. Miller next. Cold fear washed through him, more paralyzing than any mountain blizzard. This was no random attack or unfortunate accident. Old Tom's cabin had been deliberately destroyed as a warning, or perhaps simply because the old man had aided James in his journey to find Emma. And now the same men were headed toward his family's home. James secured the mule alongside his mare, gathering what undamaged supplies he could salvage from the ruins. His exhaustion vanished, replaced by desperate urgency. Wilson had been right. Sullivan's men had identified the Miller homestead. Emma's presence there had placed his entire family in danger, yet they remained unaware of the threat approaching. Mounting the mare and leading the rescued mule, James set off at the fastest pace the snow-covered terrain would allow. The most direct route would take him perilously close to the main trail where his pursuers had been traveling, but he no longer had the luxury of caution. Every minute might matter now. The afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the snow as James pushed relentlessly forward. Both animals were showing signs of fatigue, but he dared not stop for more than brief moments to allow them water and minimal rest. His own body protested the continued exertion after days of limited sleep and constant tension, yet fear for his family drove him beyond normal endurance. As dusk approached, the familiar contours of Pine Ridge Valley finally appeared. Ahead, James paused at the ridge overlooking his home, scanning the landscape for any sign of trouble. The Miller cabin stood intact, smoke rising normally from its chimney, no obvious indication of disturbance or danger. The sight should have brought relief, yet James remained tense, unconvinced that he had somehow outraced Sullivan's men to his destination. He continued down the slope more cautiously now, approaching the cabin from the rear where the barn would provide some cover for his arrival. As he drew closer, subtle wrongness in the scene became apparent. No tracks between house and barn, despite the daily chores that would have required such movement. No sign of Daniel, who typically tended the livestock at this hour. The cabin. Windows shuttered, though daylight still remained. James secured the animals in a small copse of pines 100 yards from the barn, concealing them from casual observation before advancing on foot, rifle ready. The silence pressed around him, unnatural and foreboding. Even the winter birds that typically fluttered around the feeding station Rebecca maintained were absent. The barn door stood partially open, the first clear sign that something was amiss. Robert Miller never left it unsecured, not even in the mildest weather. James edged inside, staying close to the wall where shadows would conceal his presence. The interior was dim, but enough light filtered through gaps in the wooden walls to reveal the space was empty of human presence. The family's workhorses stood in their stalls, seemingly undisturbed, though they turned their heads toward James with unusual alertness. A soft groan from the far corner sent him spinning in that direction, rifle raised. The sound came again, human, but barely so. James moved forward cautiously, squinting into the darkness, until a familiar form took shape on the straw-covered floor. Daniel! His brother lay curled on his side, one arm clutched protectively around his midsection. Blood had dried in a dark streak from his temple down his cheek. His eyes fluttered open at James's voice, struggling to focus. James, he managed, the words slurred. They came. 4 of them. Mining company men, they said. He tried to sit up, but fell back with a grimace of pain. James knelt beside him, quickly checking for serious injuries. Easy. Where are the others? Pa, Ma and Rebecca? Daniel's eyes clouded with distress, took them inside, said they just wanted to talk to the girl. But they had guns, James, and their eyes. He shook his head slightly. Cold, like snake eyes. Gee, how long ago? Hours. Hit me when I tried to stop them. Must have knocked me out. Daniel gripped James's arm suddenly, his voice strengthening with urgency. They're not here for talk. That leader, Sullivan, they called him. He means to silence the girl permanent. James helped his brother to a sitting position, mind racing. 4 armed men inside, holding his parents and sister hostage, seeking Emma for reasons he now understood all too well. The documents hidden in his coat seemed to burn against his chest, damning evidence of Sullivan's crimes that Emma had witnessed. Can you shoot? He asked Daniel, whose head wound appeared superficial despite the blood it had produced. Daniel nodded grimly. Dizzy, but I can aim straight enough at close range. James pressed his own rifle into his brother's hands, then withdrew Wilson's revolver from his coat. I need to get closer, see what we're facing. Stay here. Be ready. James? Daniel caught his sleeve as he turned to go. That girl. What did she see that's worth killing over? Briefly, James explained what he had learned from Emma's documents. The sabotaged supports, the embezzlement, the murder of engineer Harding, Emma's evidence that could bring Sullivan to justice. Daniel listened in grim silence, his expression hardening with each new detail. Pa won't let them take her without a fight, he said finally, and Sullivan must know that. The implication hung heavily between them. Robert Miller was no coward, but neither was he a fool. Against 4 armed men with his wife and daughter present, he would choose caution over confrontation, up to a point. But if Sullivan moved to harm Emma or any of the Miller family, that restraint would vanish in an instant. I need to see inside, James said. There's a chance from the root cellar, the trapdoor into the kitchen. Daniel nodded. Be careful. These aren't ordinary men. The way they moved, talked, they've killed before. James slipped out of the barn as silently as he'd entered. staying within the deepening shadows as he circled toward the cabin's far side. A narrow window there overlooked the area where the root cellar doors emerged from the ground, but the shutters appeared closed like all the others. No light escaped to betray the occupants inside. The cellar doors themselves presented the first major obstacle. Typically secured with a simple wooden bar that created considerable noise when removed, they would immediately alert anyone inside to his approach. James studied the problem, then moved to the small tool shed adjacent to the garden, returning with a pry bar that might allow him to force the doors with minimal sound. Working carefully, he managed to create just enough space to slip through, without fully opening the heavy wooden doors. The root cellar beyond lay in absolute darkness, forcing James to navigate by touch and memory through the shelves of preserved vegetables and fruits that constituted a critical portion of the family's winter sustenance. The trapdoor leading upward into the kitchen had been installed years earlier as a convenience during harvest time, allowing Margaret to transfer preserves directly from kitchen to cellar without exiting the house. It was rarely locked, relying, instead, on its heavy weight to keep it securely closed. James positioned himself beneath it, listening intently for any sound from above. Voices filtered down, muffled but distinguishable. A man speaking, his tone falsely genial. "Merely a matter of company property, Mrs. Miller. Financial records, inventory lists, nothing that should concern decent folk like yourselves." His mother's reply came clearly, her voice steady despite what must be a terrifying situation. "And this company property requires 4 armed men to retrieve it, from a sick girl who can barely stand." A different voice answered, harder than the first. "The company values its privacy, ma'am, industrial secrets and such." Lies. This was Rebecca, never one to hold her tongue even in danger. "You're not here for papers." A sharp sound, a slap perhaps, followed by Robert's voice, tight with controlled fury. "Touch my daughter again, and papers will be the least of your concerns." The ensuing silence crackled with tension, broken finally by the first voice. "All pretense of geniality gone. Let's dispense with the charade, shall we? Miss Thompson witnessed things at Blackwater she wasn't meant to see. She possesses documents that could cause considerable trouble for people who don't appreciate trouble. We're here to ensure those documents are returned and the matter closed, permanently." "She's dying anyway," Rebecca said, her voice slightly tremulous now. "The infection—" "Becca!" Margaret cautioned sharply. James had heard enough. Sullivan and his men were indeed after Emma's evidence, and they clearly intended to silence her, regardless of her condition. His family stood between killers and their target, a position that grew more dangerous with each passing minute. Tension coiled in James's muscles as he prepared to push upward on the trapdoor. The element of surprise might be his only advantage against 4 armed men. Yet rushing in blindly could prove disastrous for everyone involved. As he steeled himself to act, a new voice joined the conversation above. Weak but clear, instantly, recognizable. "I'm here." Emma's voice, surprisingly steady despite her illness. "You needn't threaten these people further. They know nothing of what happened at Blackwater." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.